Welcome back, everybody, for another deep dive. This time, we're tackling something called the Indigenous Navigator Initiative.
Ah,
Basically, we know there's a lot of data out there about Indigenous communities,
right.
but it's not just about having the data, it's what you do with it. And that's what this Navigator is all about, giving that power back to the communities themselves.
Yeah, it's really flipping the script on how these things usually work.
Exactly. So this report we're looking at, it's not just a small local thing.
No, not at all. It covers experiences from 11 different countries.
11. Wow.
Yeah, across Latin America, Asia, and Africa.
Okay, so before we get into specifics, can you give us a quick rundown of where exactly we're seeing this navigator in action? Like which countries are involved?
Sure. So in Latin America, we've got Bolivia, Colombia, Peru, and Suriname. Then over in Asia, there's Bangladesh, Cambodia, Nepal, and the Philippines.
Okay.
And then rounding it out, in Africa, we have Cameroon, Kenya, and Tanzania.
All right, so a pretty diverse group of countries there. But let's back up a second. What exactly is this Indigenous Navigator? Is it a website? A document? What are we talking about here?
It's actually kind of both. It's a framework and a set of tools. That includes things like an online portal. It's all designed to help communities monitor the status of their rights, identify gaps, where things aren't being implemented properly, and then advocate for change.
So it's giving them the tools to actually do something, not just sit back and hope things get better.
Exactly.
And you mentioned a framework. Is that like a set of rules or?
Yeah, it's like guidelines, I guess you could say, that cover over 150 different indicators.
150. Wow, that's a lot.
Yeah, it's pretty comprehensive. It covers civil rights, political rights, social, economic, cultural, you name it. And it aligns with all the major international agreements, like the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, ILO Convention 169.
They really did their homework.
Yeah, they did. And it ties into the outcomes from the World Conference on Indigenous Peoples and even the Sustainable Development Goals.
Okay, so it's connected to all these bigger global efforts. That's really interesting. But I'm curious, what are communities actually experiencing as they work with this navigator? I mean, what kind of changes are they seeing?
Well, one common theme is this idea of empowerment through understanding.
Okay.
A lot of human rights language can be really complex and hard to understand.
Oh, yeah.
But working with the Navigator helped communities break down that jargon and really grasp what their rights actually mean in practical terms.
Give me an example. How did that play out in a real community?
Well, in Colombia, for example, the survey asked people to define poverty in their own words.
Oh, interesting.
And that sparked some really insightful discussions. It got people thinking beyond just the usual economic indicators.
So they're defining the issues on their own terms. I like that. But what do they do with that understanding? Are they just having discussions or are they taking action?
Oh, they're definitely taking action. They're using the data they've collected to advocate for change, identifying key issues, setting priorities, and then going to local and national governments with this evidence to back them up.
So it's giving them a voice. That's fantastic.
It is, and it goes even further than that. The Indigenous Navigator also has this small grants facility.
Oh.
Yeah, it lets communities design and implement their own pilot projects based on whatever they decide is most important.
So they're putting their knowledge into action, learning by doing.
Exactly. And that's had a really powerful impact. In Suriname, for instance, communities contrasted this approach to past experiences, where researchers would come in, take information, and then just leave.
Yeah, I've heard that story before. Extractive research, they call it. Not very helpful for the community in the long run.
Right. But with these pilot projects, there's a real sense of ownership.
Makes a huge difference.
It does.
But I imagine there are challenges too. It can't all be smooth sailing, right?
Of course not. There are always hurdles. One of the biggest is digital access. A lot of communities, especially in remote areas, just don't have reliable internet.
Yeah, that makes sense. Makes it hard to use an online portal if you can't get online.
Exactly. So national partner organizations have been really important in bridging that gap, providing training, support, sometimes even just the physical connection.
They're boots on the ground, making sure this thing actually works.
Yeah, they are. And then another challenge is the whole translation and adaptation process.
Oh, yeah, I can imagine. Getting all those legal concepts into different languages and making sure they make sense in different cultural contexts.
Exactly. That was a big undertaking.
So how did they handle that? Were there any specific examples that stand out?
Well, in Nepal, they had to overcome some pretty significant language barriers.
Yeah.
So the organization coordinating the project provided summaries of the findings in local languages, just to make sure everyone was on the same page.
Makes sense. And then how do they keep the momentum going? I mean, once the initial excitement of a new project fades, how do they make sure the impact lasts?
That's the key question, isn't it? It requires ongoing support for local partners and making sure communities have the knowledge and skills to use the Navigator for the long haul.
So it's not a one and done kind of thing.
Definitely not. And in the Philippines, the partner organization has been really vocal about the need for capacity building, making sure local partners can use the Navigator effectively even after the project funding ends.
That's great foresight. So we've covered a lot of ground here, from the global scope of this thing down to the very personal experiences of the communities involved. As we wrap up this first part of our deep dive, what really stands out to you?
What strikes me is how this initiative shifts the focus.
Oh,
It's not just about gathering data.
okay.
It's about giving communities the power to use that data to champion their own rights and development.
It's about putting them in the driver's seat, right?
Exactly. And that's really inspiring. We've only scratched the surface.
Right. We still have a lot to unpack, so we'll dive deeper into the specific challenges and successes in the next part of our exploration. Stay tuned.
Okay, so picking up where we left off, let's zoom in on some of the specific challenges and opportunities that came up as they were implementing this Indigenous Navigator. One thing that kept popping up in the report was this tension between having this global framework and then the very specific needs of each community.
Yeah, that makes sense. You can't just have a one-size-fits-all approach, especially when you're dealing with something as diverse as indigenous cultures, right?
Right, exactly. Like the survey questions, for instance. They were designed to be broad enough to apply to lots of different situations,
Hmm.
but sometimes that actually made them harder to understand.
Oh, interesting. So it's not just the language then, it's making sure the questions themselves are relevant to each community.
Exactly. One of the partner organizations in Colombia, they pointed out that some communities, especially those that weren't as familiar with Western ways of thinking, sometimes had trouble grasping what the questions were getting at.
So it's about bridging those different worldviews, not just translating words. How did they handle that? Did they just reword the questions or?
It involved a lot of training, really making sure everyone understood the purpose of the framework, and then adapting the wording to fit the local context.
Sounds like a lot of work. Those national partner organizations really seem to be the key here, huh?
Oh, absolutely. They're the ones on the ground making sure this tool is actually usable.
So let's talk about the successes. We've talked about the hurdles, but where has this navigator really made a difference? Give me an inspiring story.
Okay, well, one that really stands out is from Bangladesh. The partner organization there, they were focused on improving education in the Chittagong Hill Tracts.
Education. So important, especially for indigenous communities. It can be the key to breaking cycles of poverty and marginalization. What was the situation there?
Well, through the Navigator surveys, they found out that a lot of children in the L tracts weren't getting a quality education.
Oh, no.
Yeah, things like teachers not showing up regularly and a lack of basic resources, it was really holding them back.
So they had the data, they knew what the problem was. What did they do with it? Did they just throw their hands up in the air?
No way. They organized meetings where parents and community members could voice their concerns directly to the school management committees.
So they were holding the teachers accountable. I love that.
Yeah, it was really empowering. And they didn't stop there. They also started going to government offices and advocating for better resources and teacher training. And because they had this evidence from the Navigator, they weren't just complaining, they were coming with solutions.
So they went from identifying the problem to demanding action.
Amazing.
Hmm.
And what was the outcome of all this? Did anything actually change?
It did. They've actually seen some real progress. Now, local teacher training programs include modules on effective teaching methods, directly addressing the concerns that were raised through the Navigator.
That's incredible. A real tangible change. And all because they had the data to back up their demands. Right. And they've accomplished even more. The partner organization has also been working with the national government to push for ethnic identity to be included in the upcoming census.
Wow. So they're influencing policy at a national level, making sure those communities are counted and their needs are recognized. That's a huge win.
It is. And it really shows how this bottom-up approach can have a ripple effect and lead to some really significant changes.
You know, we talked earlier about the connection between the Indigenous Navigator and the Sustainable Development Goals. Can we dig into that a bit more? How does that actually play out in practice?
Well, the Navigator framework was specifically designed to align with the SDGs. In fact, every one of the 57 pilot projects that were funded through this initiative contributes to multiple SDGs.
So it's not just about Indigenous rights in isolation, it's connecting them to this broader global effort.
Exactly. And, the SDGs emphasize leaving no one behind. The Indigenous Navigator ensures that Indigenous communities are part of that vision, that they have a seat at the table when we're talking about sustainable development.
It's recognizing that their knowledge and their perspectives are essential for building a truly sustainable future. This is fascinating stuff. There's so much to unpack here, and I feel like we've only just scratched the surface.
I know, right?
Can't wait to see what else we will uncover in the final part of our deep dive. Okay, so we're back for the last part of our deep dive into the Indigenous Navigator. We've talked about what it is, how it works, but now I want to talk about the bigger picture. Why should our listeners care about this? What's the takeaway here?
Yeah, good question. If we take a step back, the Navigator is really about more than just data or pilot projects. It's about fundamental rights. It's about self-determination. And it's about changing how we approach development, making it more inclusive.
So it's acknowledging that Indigenous communities have the knowledge and the right to decide their own futures.
Exactly. And the stories in the report really bring that to life. Like in Peru, the organization leading the initiative there talk about how the Navigator helped communities realize they were being overlooked by the government. And it gave them the data to actually do something about it, to demand their rights.
So they went from feeling powerless to taking charge.
Exactly. And that this isn't just happening at a local level. The partner organization in Cambodia, they've actually used the Navigator to advocate for a national technical working group.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and this group would focus specifically on the development and conservation needs of Indigenous peoples.
So they're having an impact on policy at a national level, making sure Indigenous voices are part of the decision making.
Exactly. And we see this happening in other places too. Like in Kenya, the Navigator has helped bridge the gap between communities and their local governments.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, leading to better collaboration, a more responsive government. But it's not just about tackling problems. It's also about celebrating success.
Right. Focusing on what's working.
Exactly. Like in Suriname, the pilot projects were so successful because they gave communities a real chance to design and manage projects themselves, based on their own priorities.
It was their project, so they were invested in making it work.
Yeah, and that sense of ownership, that's really key to this whole initiative. It's not about outsiders coming in and saying, here's what you need to do.
It's about empowering communities to lead the way.
Exactly.
So we've seen the Navigator working in all these different places. But what about the future? What happens next?
Well, there's still challenges, of course. Like we talked about before, digital access is still a big one.
Especially for those remote communities.
Yeah. And we need to keep investing in things like infrastructure, training, to make sure everyone can actually benefit from the online tools. And then there's also the challenge of keeping the momentum going.
Making sure the impact of the Navigator lasts.
Exactly. That requires long-term commitment from funders, from local partners, and continued capacity building within the communities.
So there's still a lot of work to be done. But it sounds like there's a lot of hope, too. Any final thoughts for our listeners, something they can take away from this and maybe even apply to their own lives?
What inspires me most about the Indigenous Navigator is that it represents a different way of thinking about knowledge and power. It's recognizing that the people closest to the problems often have the best solutions. It's about listening to those voices, making sure they're heard, and supporting their right to self-determination. And that's a lesson we can all learn from.
That's a great point. And on that note, that wraps up our deep dive into the Indigenous Navigator initiative. I don't know about you, but I'm feeling really energized after learning about this project. It's a reminder that change is possible, and even small actions can have a big impact. Thanks for joining us, and until next time, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep diving deep.